I am Daniel Stein from Stewards of Change and one of the leads on the National Interoperability Collaborative. And I want to welcome everybody to today's session where we are talking about Niem in particular and the Niem fundamentals. We have had a somewhat of a change to the schedule today. Unfortunately, Robert, who was our second presenter, had a personal family emergency, so he is not going to be joining us today. Unfortunately, we were really looking forward to providing the foundation for Niem and then moving into the Niem health domain, but unfortunately that's not going to happen today. So we will reschedule that at the earliest time we can. Hopefully, you know, pretty close proximity to this one, so we can really leverage the learning and the knowledge that's available there. I would point out that Robert has spoken previously on the Niem domain, and you can find that information on the NIC site. For those of you who are familiar with it, there is a recording of it, like there is a recording today of it. So if you want to get an advanced peek of what that's about, by all means, feel free to go to that and look at it. So we have an extended period of time, which is great. We have Dr. Scott Renner, who will be presenting, and we, as I said, because we have the considerable amount of time, we'll be able to dive into the questions, comments, thoughts, and reflections in today's session, which will be a great opportunity to be able to really dive into this topic. I'm really delighted to be able to go into it. So just a little bit of housekeeping here. I think you're all muted right now. You can unmute yourself when you want to ask a question and or make a comment, or momentarily maybe we're going to do some quick introductions for new people. And then we do really want to hear from you. As I mentioned, one of the things we try to do on these calls, which we've been doing for the last 6 months or so, is to engage in questions and conversation as best we can. And so you can do that a couple ways. You can write your comments in the chat panel, and Sandesh, who is on the call with us as part of the team, will make sure to flag that, make sure we see it. If we don't see it, you can raise your hand. There's a little option for that, and then you can just break into the conversation as the spirit moves you. You know, online conversations can be very, you know, a little stilted as you try to have a conversation. So, you know, no harm, no foul, as they say, with just kind of jumping in and out. And for those of you who are using the phone line, you can mute and unmute yourself by using the *6. I'll just reiterate again that this is being recorded, and it'll go up on the site pretty quickly. So you can share it, you can review it if you so choose, and you can share it with your friends and colleagues as you go forward. If you haven't signed up yet for the hub, the URL is right there. Feel free to join. There's lots of good material and content on there, and a growing community that we'll talk about in just a second there. So the agenda for today, we're going to just do some quick new participant introductions, and then a tiny one or two slides on the NIC background for people who are new to it, just to give you a sense of who we are, why we're here, and what we're doing. And of course, there's plenty more material on the website itself, but want to really take that opportunity. And as I said, the bulk of the time, Dr. Renner will provide conversation around Niem for us as well. And then just to point out some upcoming webinars that we have scheduled. Typically, we've been doing our Let's Get Technical calls on Fridays since September. And so there's a whole bunch of them that have transpired. And coming up this Friday is one on child welfare. And then the following week will be on addressing data collaboration challenges with BrightHive. And then following that, actually a little bit later, we've got a couple more that we're scheduling now for later. We have a terrific presentation by the public libraries around the opioid crisis, and we'll get into more of that. You'll see some material and that we'll be sending out shortly on there. We're planning on running these through the middle of May right now, so there'll be plenty of content that will be available to folks, and more about that as we go forward. Before we dive into what is the National Interoperability Club, what I want to do is just pretty quickly, in less than 10 minutes or less, is open the floor basically for people who want to introduce themselves. It's been fascinating, interesting, and also very insightful to know who is on the phone with us. A lot of people are coming back after week, so you can see their profile on the member site once you've signed up. But it is a nice opportunity to hear who else is on the calls with us here today. So the way we have done that, which is the best way that we figured out so far, is for people to just write their name into the chat box. That's why before I was pointing out where the chat box is. And if you write your name in there, I will call on you, and I would ask you to say kind of who you are, where you're from, and kind of what you do in a fairly succinct order. There may be a number of people who are trying to get on here, so just quickly, but it's also very fascinating with that. So we already have first volunteer here, so Helga, if you can unmute yourself and say hello, welcome, it'd be great.
Yeah, my name is Helga Rippin. I'm the Chief Health, Interoperability, and Veteran Access Officer for the VA, and work in the Office of Technical Integration.
That is great. Thank you very much. Any more? Might be a shy crowd here today. There we go. Thank you much. Hey, Tom Carlson, welcome.
Hey.
Say hello.
So I'm Tom Carlson. I've been doing Niem stuff for as long as there's been a Niem, and so that's where my main interest lies when we're talking about interoperability and data standards and things like that. I come from really the justice world, mainly courts, but moved from there to juvenile justice and moved from there to human services. For a little while, I was maintaining the human services domain for Niem, and now I'm spreading my reach further if I can into health and basically this whole community.
Thanks so much. Gail, hello.
Hi there. So this is Gail from the VA, and I used to be with FHA. Great to see so many people that I know have worked within the Niem and the health space before, and I'm excited to see what's going on today after being away from it for about a year.
That's great. Welcome back. Nicolay. Okay, so Nicolay, if you want to say hello, by all means, just unmute yourself twice. I'm going to move to Jim Blum.
Hi, I'm Jim Blum. I'm with the clinical office, clinical max and data management office in DHA, where I'm clinical director for our data management and analytics with an interest in large data set analytics.
Thank you very much. It was a little muffled, but I think we got the gist of that. Sean Gunderson.
So Nikolai Lipsky, I'm here. I'm sorry.
Oh, there you go. Great.
So I'm from CDC, Center for Emergency Preparedness and Response. I have more than 30 years of interoperability experience. I'm participant of Niem. I'm actively involved in development of Niem domain related to emergency preparedness, specifically public health preparedness and response. Thank you.
Great to have you on board here. I imagine a little busy these days. What's going on there? Next, Sean, are you on with us?
Yeah, I am. Good afternoon.
Hey.
This is Sean Gunderson with Untitled Technologies. We're a care coordination platform, and we find ourselves right in the middle of the interoperability world at the intersection of healthcare and justice. So we're excited to be here.
Great, thanks so much. Welcome. Galen. Okay, as you work through the unmuting labyrinth, let me turn to Meredith. And see, Meredith, if you're on and have been able to unmute yourself, say hello.
Hello, excuse me. Yes, I think I successfully unmuted. Now I can't talk though.
Yes.
Excuse me. Good morning, everyone. I'm Meredith Hennessy with Consilience Group. We're a professional services firm that works with large-scale human services nonprofits who do a lot of work with government as well as healthcare institutions, really looking at ultimately how to help them connect across domains and provide more integrated, people-centered services. And so we've been connected with the NIC for probably a year plus now, and I don't always get to join on these calls, but I'm very interested in the topic today and had some opening in my schedule, and so excited to be able to hear the presentation.
Thanks so much. Valerie.
Hi, this is Galen.
Hey, Galen. Welcome.
My apologies. I wasn't just muted. I was double muted. So this is Galen Mulrooney.
A trick.
I am a contractor supporting the Veteran Health Administration's knowledge-based systems group, and I'm a standards and interoperability architect. Interestingly, I used to be the lead modeler for the Federal Health Information Model, and hi, Gail and Nikolai, where we actually were modeling parts of NIEM. And so I'd be very interested in seeing where NIEM Health has gone since then.
That's fantastic. Quite a coterie of experts here, which is fantastic. The conversation should be fascinating. A few more people. Valerie, are you muted or double unmuted? Okay, well,
Hi, can you hear me?
Oh, there you go. There you go.
Well, good afternoon or good morning to some. Valerie Rogers here, Director of Government Relations with HIMSS. Also a strong supporter of the Stewards of Change work on interoperability or interoptimability across the spectrum of care. Been working in the public health space, working to connect public health, clinical care, and human services for quite a while now. So really happy to be a part of the discussion today.
Thank you. Welcome. Looking forward to seeing you at HIMSS soon.
Indeed.
It'll be great. Christine.
Yes, good afternoon. This is Christine McCoy. I am a family physician. I work for basically a private, not-for-profit public health agency. And we are one of the Integrated Care for Kids grantees for the state of New Jersey. And I have the honor of being in charge of building the integrated technology system for that Integrated Care for Kids platform here in New Jersey. So I need all the help I can get from all of you.
Excellent. Great. Sonia.
Hi, good morning, y'all. I'm a business architect with the California Health and Human Services Office of the Agency Information Officer, and I'm excited to participate and stay informed on NIEM and interoperability related content, as that's something that we're focusing on at the moment.
Fantastic. Good to hear. Good to hear. Ken Saul.
Hi, I'm with OptumServe, and we've been working for close to 8 years supporting the Affordable Care Act, the Data Services Hub, and we've been using NIEM pretty much all that time, but it's an older version of NIEM. I'm sorry, that's for health insurance information, basically.
Excellent. Thank you very much. All right. Well, I think I got everybody. I don't know if there's anyone else that I didn't call. But for folks who are on the call, and as you ask, a little bit of background right there. If you, hold on. Okay. Sorry about that. Just mute a few people here. So for folks who are going to be participating in the call, by all means, just introduce yourself when you jump on, and so we know who you are. But welcome, and thank you for the introduction. I'm always impressed and excited about the variety of folks who are joining the call from across the nation and across different disciplines, experts in some of the fields, and people who are new and interested to it. So it's one of the more gratifying parts of doing these webinars and supporting them is really reaching out more broadly to the larger universe, and which is actually a perfect segue into my one slide on the National Interoperability Collaborative. And the reason we're here in many ways is because of the generous support from the Kresge Foundation, who saw the need, value, and the utility of helping bring together different communities who are working across domains, recognizing that health, safety, well-being are all part of a whole person care approach, and that without that, we're only seeing a part of the puzzle, so to speak. And so the NIC, as we refer to it, is a community of networks. We recognize that each of the areas is its own universe, a large universe at that, and that everybody is doing, a lot of unique things, but a lot of things that are complementary across human services, public health, education, et cetera, et cetera. And what our purpose, our goal, our mission, our vision is to really help facilitate the cross-domain learning and also the communication that can potentially happen and support us in times of natural disaster or in times of, sort of personal disaster, people who need to really access and use information from across multiple domains. I think, waking up today with the scare of the coronavirus and thinking about how well we're prepared for communication across all of these domains, sort of reinforces the importance of this. I want to really reinforce the idea of a community of networks, recognizing that everybody has their own universe that they're working in, and how do we share that information and knowledge. A couple of years ago, with and in partnership with HIMSS and Valerie's support, thank you very much, we were able to dive into this concept a little bit more deeply as HIMSS was looking at interoperability beyond the healthcare space and realm. And we produced a report and paper that actually looks at the domains, 6 domains, and kind of compares and contrasts a bit around what are they doing similarly, what are the strategies, what are the funding mechanisms, what are the technologies, what are the opportunities. And I would refer people who have interest in this sort of cross-dimensional, multidisciplinary, lateral kind of thinking is to take a look at that. We are hoping as these weekly calls and regular calls happen that we begin to facilitate those cross-domain conversations. So even in today's call, I encourage people to bring their perspective from whether or not it's education or healthcare or medical responses to this conversation. And we intend to build out more of those kind of cross-domain conversations intentionally so we can really build that out, which I think is a unique contribution to the field as we look at it right now. And so with that, and you can find all this material on the Stewards website. You have the community. If you haven't joined feel free to go ahead and join it. And let me turn now to Kate Ryan, who is managing the Niem Health domain on the NIC Hub, and she's going to do some introduction and then pass it off. So, Kate, are you there?
I am here. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Hello, everyone. If you've been participating in these NIC calls, then you've heard me talk a little bit about Niem Health in the past. And I'm glad to see new faces, and some of those new faces are also familiar, or I should say new names, are also familiar names and ones that I've worked with. Gail was actually my director when I worked for the Federal Health Architecture, so hi, Gail. And we began and I'm just going to give a real brief context to some of the discussion today. But so FHA was the lead for a Niem Health Community of Interest. The Federal Health Architecture Program, after 10 fantastic years, has sunset, which left an opening for the Niem Health Community of Interest to be picked up by another federal agency. As of now, and has been reported on these calls in the past, Rob DeGallicott with the OCIO, so the Office for the Chief Information Officer in HHS, him and his colleagues have expressed interest in standing up or continuing the work for the Niem Health Community of Interest and then standing up a Niem Health domain. We do know from his remarks in the past that the focus will be, his proposed focus will be for social determinants of health, looking into the opioid crisis now with this coronavirus, how we may be able to leverage health information across different domains for that, some of what Daniel was just speaking about. But he also wanted to use today as a way to speak with folks and understand sort of maybe your interest or where you see the most value for Niem and healthcare. And maybe he missed the mark when he was talking about SDOH and opioids. So that was going to be part of today's discussion. If you joined a little bit later, Daniel did say in the beginning that unfortunately, Rob is preoccupied at the moment with a family emergency, so he will not be joining today's call. So if we get around to speaking about Niem Health, we won't get into too much of detail later on in today's discussion, just because we can't speak on Rob's behalf. So we will be working with Rob to get that rescheduled as quickly as possible, and we'll reach out to everybody on this call and let you know when that is. We'll also broadcast it on our various social media networks and as well as the NIC Collaboration Hub. I do encourage folks, if you're interested in hearing about Niem Health, or if you missed the opportunity to hear from Rob Tagalicott and his thoughts on Niem Health a few weeks back, you can find a recording of when he last spoke to the group, and that's on the Niem Health's Potential NIC Collaboration page. So please feel free to check that out as well, get you up to speed. There's a lot of good content there, and it will definitely be a fantastic precursor for when we have that rescheduled discussion with Rob. But one thing that I took note of pretty early on is that a lot of people who were, joining these calls didn't necessarily know what Niem was. They thought perhaps maybe it's just a data model, which you'll learn today that it actually offers quite a bit more. So they weren't understanding what Niem was, how it could be different from other standards, how it can leverage other standards. There were just a lot of questions. So I really was hoping that today would be more of an educational piece to really set the stage of Niem's value, and then help folks understand where it can help with healthcare, as well as in a lot of other domains. So this first portion is really meant to be an educational series, and it is not just going to be focused on health. So with that, I will turn things over to Dr. Renner from the Niem Management Office.
Well, hello, everybody. My name's Scott Renner, and I am the Federal Chair of the Niem Technical Architecture Committee. We are the group that writes the technical specifications that make Niem work, and we're responsible for introducing new technologies into the Niem. My co-chair, Mike Holm, represents state and local. He's not with us today, but I heard a couple of other NTAC members on the phone, Brian Hanspicker and Tom Carlson. I invite them to speak up in this presentation when they can make it better, and I invite them to tell me what's wrong with it privately later. Can we go forward? What's next on the slides? Okay, yep. I just said everything I wanted to say on this slide. Let's go to the next one. This is an overview of the things that I plan to talk about, beginning with some background of why Niem is helpful, especially in very large enterprises. I'll be talking about my experience with the Department of Defense and data interoperability over nearly 30 years. Then we'll talk about the technical features of Niem. What special things is it bringing to data sharing? A series of cartoons that explains how designing an information exchange with Niem is a lot like building a model with data Legos. And then finally, there are some Niem myths that are around, and I want to see if I can bust up some of those. So yeah, let's go to the next slide, data sharing. This basically is the thing that Niem is supposed to help with. You've got people who have information, you got people who want information, they're using some kind of automated systems, and the problem is to get the data from where it is to where it needs to be. There are a number of problems for doing that. The consumer has to know that the thing exists. He has to have some kind of a communications pipe so the bits can flow. Niem is aiming at problems of understanding and interoperability. What does the data mean when he gets it, and is his system going to do the right thing? Let's go to the next slide. A lot of the data that's getting shared is intended for what I call user presentation. We might as well be looking at it with the browser. The data is examined by the end user. He understands what it means. He understands how it's relevant to the decision he's trying to make, and then he just does the right thing with it. There may well be a programmer involved in this, writing code for the browser, or maybe code for displaying an image. But that programmer is not involved in the decision that the consumer is trying to make. He doesn't need to know anything about what this data means. He just needs to know how to display it. Next slide. So Niem can help with that user presentation sharing, but it's really intended for the machine-to-machine data sharing that I'm talking about on this slide. Sometimes the data that is shared isn't seen by the user. It's input to an automated process that may eventually show some kind of results, but the actual data itself is not understood by the end user. It has to be understood by the developer who's writing his software tool. And that developer isn't going to see the data at runtime either. So the only thing that he has to understand is the specification that tells him what the data means. Since he's not going to be there at runtime, his understanding better be correct, or somebody is going to have a system that does the wrong thing. Niem is especially aimed at this problem. So here's the sort of the overview of what Niem does and why it's important. We see the people and the systems as before. The data that gets exchanged, in Niem we call it an information exchange package, but you can think of it as a message, or you can think of it as a resource that's on the web and people can pull it when they want it. It works for all of those. The point of Niem is to design the contents of the purple box above. We call it an information exchange package documentation. And this is here to tell the developers what they have to put in those messages and what the contents mean. Then the developers have to understand the spec. They write code that takes data out of the source system, puts it out through some kind of interface into the message. The message shows up at the other system. There's a developer who writes code to parse it, put it into the system, and do the right thing with it. Niem does not care at all about how the information exchange package gets from the source to the consumer. You can use email, you can use HTTP, you can put it on a floppy and walk it across. We do not care about that. We only care about what the data means and what data has to be in the message. Let's go to the next slide.
So if I could just jump in for a second and just pause for Danielle, actually, just to ask for some clarifications. Once an IEPD is written, can you, maybe you're going to speak about this a little later, is that now useful for anybody else who's got that same data exchange need?
Absolutely.
Or is it done for every time?
Absolutely. We do not intend to be constructing pairwise exchanges at all. Anybody who wants to send messages of this type or receive messages of this type can get the IEPD, use it to write their software. And in fact, that happens a lot.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Good point.
I mean, if I can just add to that, this is Tom. You know, the whole technical underpinnings of Niem is designed to make it easy to extend, easy to add new things to. That's the Niem itself, but that carries over into IEPDs as well. So when I make an IEPD and I'm building it off of Niem, it's very easy to take my IEPD and build further from it. So that if somebody else has needs similar to mine, but a little different, it's very easy to take what I've done and modify it for similar but different circumstances. So people don't have to start from scratch. Even if they're not doing exactly the same thing that I am, they can still leverage the work I've done as long as they're doing something similar.
Can you give a specific example of an IEPD that would make sense to this audience?
So the one that I like to talk about is the automated alarm exchange specification, or something like that. It is the IEPD that defines messages that are sent from alarm companies who get your alarm signal and the local 911 center that's going to dispatch the police to check it out. That used to happen through phone calls and who knows what.
Mm-hmm.
It now happens through an automated system talking to another automated system, passing a message that's defined in a Niem specification. And there's many 911 centers that have implemented that IEPD, and then there's also many alarm companies that have implemented it, and all of their systems work together just fine.
Great, thank you. All right, should I advance?
Yes. So this is a picture of the basic problem that Niem is trying to address. If you want this machine-to-machine data exchange to work, it's essential that the producer's understanding of the data and the consumer's understanding of the data are compatible. If they aren't, then something's going to go bad at runtime. You're not going to get the data exchange you want. So the next series of slides are about the difficulty of establishing this compatible understanding in a large enterprise. Let's go to the next chart. So the simplest approach is always, and the fastest approach is always some kind of pairwise negotiation. Put the programmers in a room, don't let them out until they've made an agreement. Some kind of intermediate format that everybody understands. Then the producer puts out a message in that format. The consumer understands that message in that format, and everything can be made to work pretty quickly for this particular pair. But there are a couple of problems with it. One is that the knowledge created by those developers gets recorded in source code and otherwise lost. And it's really hard to get knowledge back out of source code. So the work that they're doing is not going to be reusable, and it's not going to last longer than these particular developers are on the project. But then there's another problem that overwhelms everything as your enterprise gets large. Let's go to the next chart. If you got a lot of pairs, then you have a very large number of pairwise negotiations, and it's just not practical. The total effort grows with the square of the number of participants in your enterprise. You can't afford it. Department of Defense realized this in the late 80s, and in like 1990, they thought we're spending maybe a quarter of our software effort in maintaining these interfaces, and we can't keep doing that. Which leads you to the other approach that isn't going to work. Next chart. But it's very attractive to the military mind. If we have problems that are caused by data differences, then if we get rid of the differences, we'll get rid of the problems. Let's just tell everybody to use the same data model. One big model of everything for the community of everyone. This actually works great if your enterprise is sufficiently small and cohesive, and you have some kind of effective governance over it. But in a large enterprise, like, for example, the Department of Defense, and I'm totally certain, like all of the participants in the healthcare enterprise, it's not going to scale up. Next chart, explain why this doesn't work at large scale. 4 reasons. The first is the amount of knowledge that's involved in that model of everything is too large to be learned by too many people. You can't afford it. And it takes a long time for people to learn what's in that large model of everything. The knowledge exchange that's required for the understanding, person by person, is slow, because the input port for knowledge is kind of constrained, and the best technology is still a whiteboard and a coffee pot. And then, no, back one, not quite ready yet. Even if you could somehow get everybody to understand the model of everything for the community of everybody, you'll find that the missions of the union of the missions of the enterprise change faster than you can keep up with changing the model to support it. And finally, these things are single model approaches are always imposed top down, and doing it top down ignores a lot of the knowledge that the people involved already have. So Department of Defense tried this from 1991 until 2000 and abandoned it because as unworkable. Next chart.
If I can add one more thing to that. And you know, you see kind of the origin of Niem from the justice world in the fact that in the justice world, you can't force things top down. You don't have the authority. Nobody has the authority to do that. You know, every state's got its own court system, and in some states, those court systems aren't unified. There is no top-down methodology in the justice world to essentially dictate much of anything. And so it's almost by necessity that the justice world is where this first starts, because it's the only way to do this stuff. You just can't do top down. You don't have the authority. You don't have the power. You don't have the leverage.
And what Tom says is true, I think, for almost any large enterprise. There may be people at the top with delusions of control, but effective top-down control is just not there. There are always groups that are effectively autonomous. And if you want them to work together to share information, you must be thinking in terms of cooperation and influence, and not in terms of commands and control. That's my main sermon about information technology in the large. Can we go to the next one?
Sure, just a quick question on large, because I think there's a tendency for, you know, I'm not sure the magnitude we're talking about here, but for some organizations which are smaller to try to do that. Are we talking about sort of, you know, the community-based organization who can, everybody under one roof, you know, we've got the definition to do a specified kind of program, versus like a DoD, which has got, you know, bazillion people all over the globe? Is there a place where this model actually would work, or are you suggesting that it really is not effective anywhere?
No, it definitely does work. And the smaller your enterprise, the better it is. If you're writing software with 10 developers, of course you do this. You don't let each developer have his own data model and try and figure out how to cooperate. You just tell them, this is what we're doing. You scale that up, and eventually the effectiveness of saying, this is what we're doing, no longer works. The largest thing that I've seen that looked like it worked in the Department of Defense was in the Strategic Command. They have had a fairly complex data model on the order of hundreds of tables, and it worked for them, but they are pretty cohesive. The guys that are planning the single integrated plan for nuclear strikes don't have to talk to a whole lot of other people. And the guy who commands the operators was also the acquisition authority and also controlled the money. If you have all of those things and you're not too big, then I think this approach can work.
Excellent.
So let's look at the next slide. What did the Department of Defense do? And I thought it was pretty smart, even if it was my idea. Basically, if you can't have the one model of everything for everybody, then it means you're going to have more than one community and more than one model for them. It's just no plain reason. So this can work. You divide things up into, in Niem we would call them domains. The Department of Defense, we call them communities of interest. People who need to exchange data, and they need a common understanding of what that data means, and turn them loose to produce the model that will work for them. So this is a plus, and it gets you a lot, but it's not perfect. Next slide. Because you'll always find that these communities of interest overlap. If you could partition the world into distinct communities and nobody cared about any other community, that would be great. But that's never going to happen. So even if you divide into wonderful communities of interest and they do a marvelous job on their data model, you still got the same old problems we had before, just on a smaller scale. It turns out that there's something nice that we can do about this remaining problem. Next chart. It's possible and desirable to arrange communities into a rough hierarchy so that you have at the top hierarchy, you have a large community and they agree on a few things. And then what they agree on is extended, used and extended by smaller communities that agree on more things. My theory is that this is the optimum way to arrange your data modeling once your enterprise becomes too big for a single model. Something broad and shallow.
Can I interrupt for?
Yeah, go.
I was just going to ask you one question. You've used the term data modeling, and I want to take the opportunity because this is an introduction to Niem, just to make sure everyone's on the same page. So can you spend just a few minutes when you talk about data modeling? And maybe this is too rudimentary, but I suspect there may be other people with that question.
So if you're exchanging data, there's always going to be some components in the data you're exchanging, and we use the term data element to talk about the definition of those chunks of data. It will be the names and definitions and relations between data elements. Now, exactly what model formalism you use for this is kind of up in the air, but it's always going to be captured, at least I think capturable, by an entity relationship model. In Niem, our model is built on top of the resource description framework meta model. So we have resources and properties and values. In XML, those are elements and other elements and values. Is that making sense?
Yeah, and I guess the question is, those are then agreed upon by the community. At what point do those get agreed upon by the community so they become sort of the standard data elements? Is that within the governance models?
It is. That is the business side of Niem. So I usually don't talk about it a lot, but let's go to the next chart where the Niem model enters the picture. Because the Niem model follows that hierarchical approach that I described on the previous slide. The Niem model is broken into a Niem core, which defines concepts that are useful in many different domains, things like the attributes of a person, locations. Lots of people talk about where things are. And if you look at the word bubble at the bottom, you get some idea of what is in the Niem core model. And then the Niem model is broken up into a number of subject area domains. Each of these domains reuses the stuff in the core, and then they extend the core to capture whatever it is that they need to talk about in their data exchanges. So Niem is different from the one big model of everything in two ways. And one is this division into a core and then a number of independently governed domains. The second thing that's unique about the Niem model, or different about it, is that the Niem model is not intended to be complete for any specific purpose. The model of everything has to cover the union of everything everybody wants to talk about, but Niem is more interested in a rough intersection. What are the things that lots of people need in their data exchanges? So when you're building a Niem data exchange, you almost always end up extending the Niem model, just as Tom said a little bit ago. Hierarchical structure and incomplete but useful, those are I think the hallmarks of the Niem data model.
Excuse me, Scott, this is Brian.
Go.
I just wanted to add in the additional thought that at least with major revisions of Niem. We also have the notion of being able to pick up elements that have been defined within individual domains that were once thought only useful within that domain, and kind of sweeping them back into core, or vice versa, moving things from core that now appear to be only domain specific back to the domains. It's a process that's called harmonization. So I just wanted to forewarn folks that the definition of whether or not something is core or domain specific may be a bit fungible at major releases.
They also move between domains, especially as new domains come into place. So for a long time, a lot of human services type things were in the justice domain because there was no human services domain. Human service domain comes along and you pull those things out and you put them in human services. Well, guess what else there's a lot of in human services? There's a lot of health stuff, because up until now, there really hasn't been a health domain. So now you'll probably see things pulled out of human services and put into the health domain as more subject-specific domains come into play. They tend to collect elements that were previously put into other domains simply because there was no other place to put them.
And I am hoping that with Niem Health Domain being stood up, that we'll be able to do that kind of harmonization across the 6 different domains that currently have health-related elements defined in them, either by moving things into the health domain or at least acknowledging that these healthcare-related elements have been defined specific to, say, justice or human services, and maintain an inventory of where they are and what they are. Over.
One question, Daniel, I would add or ask is, at what point does it move to the core? Is it if it's in more than 2 domains, does it move to the core, or does it only live in one domain or in the core?
Well, just as an example from yesterday's harmonization meeting, we had some definitions for location, which were specific to the justice domain. In sort of reading between the lines, obviously they were trying to talk about beds in cells, in buildings, in facilities. But it became clear that the general concept was useful, of being able to talk about beds in a hospital, for instance, or conference rooms for having meetings. So these elements that had been originally defined by the justice domain to reflect the realities in prisons, we agreed really should be made part of core, and have the definitions just broadened a little bit in order to not be specific to prisons, but be more generally useful.
Mm-hmm. Great. That's wonderful.
Scott, this is Eric Young from Alexandria Consulting. Something you said was very interesting to me. I learned something new. I was just hoping to get a recap, but when you mentioned that the Niem model is now expressed in RDF, I had been familiar with the XML schema representations of the Niem model. But is there an ontology or someplace some sort of artifacts I can look at to see the RDF expression of the Niem model?
So let me clarify. The Niem meta model is based on the RDF meta model. The meaning of XML components in Niem conforming data is the meaning of corresponding tuples in RDF. So that part's actually working now. I have a piece of software that I've been writing in my copious free time that can convert any Niem XML document into Niem JSON LD, which is an RDF syntax.
Well, that is very exciting. I'd love to have a link to your code because we might need it soon for a proof of concept we're working on.
It's going to be open source as soon as I can work the minor paperwork to make it open source. So
Great.
the Niem data model at present is still only an XML schema. We have not done the work of saying how the Niem data model, the XML schema components, would map to RDFS and OWL, although we are working on that.
And I have seen your document, or I don't know if it was yours, but some document on how to take any Niem XML construct and convert it to JSON LD. I think I saw something on the web with guidance on that process, which your code probably uses.
Yeah, we've got some guidance up on the Niem GitHub site. And there's a specification for Niem JSON that I think is ready for beta review, but I do not know where it's published. So we are working on that stuff.
Thank you for all your great work.
Golly, I feel good. I have one more thing I wanted to say on this Niem model to build on what Brian and Tom were saying. The reason all of this works is because of the cooperation between independently governed domains. Domains aren't dictated to by anybody. The decision on what goes into Niem core is driven by what the NBAC members think will be useful in the core. And the NBAC is made up of representatives from each of the domains. This independent governance of subject area domain models is, I think, the reason why Niem works as well as it does. Are we ready to move on?
I think so.
Okay, so hey, here's some little review of what we talked about so far, emphasizing compatible understanding of data. And what matters is the knowledge in the user and developer's head. Documentation is a tool to help you with that. Once your enterprise gets too big, you can't make it with pairwise agreement or single logical model. So the best you can do is this model hierarchy we've been talking about. And right now, I don't see anything that fits better than Niem into this approach. This ecological niche of being the data exchange specification framework, something that you can use to define lots of different data exchanges. The other contenders, the other things that you might use, are either find that they're domain specific, whereas Niem tries to be useful to anybody, or they don't have the core and domain hierarchy I think you need. This is one reason why I think Niem is important and worth continuing and trying to spread. Next. So the next thing on the plate is just to walk through some of the unique or distinguishing technical features of Niem. What is it that we're offering to developers and managers and data architects? Next slide. So if you see Niem data today, it's going to almost certainly be an XML document that looks kind of like this. Next chart. So one of the things that Niem brings to the table is an interpretation for XML data. I mean, there's lots of ways that you can take the same information and put it into an XML document. And if you're trying to build a data specification by composing agreed data components from different communities, then you don't want to have to look at all the different ways you can represent data in XML. You want everybody to have one way, and that's what Niem offers here. There's an easy, simple interpretation of Niem data, and it's based on the RDF conceptual model. So if you read this data, what it means, it tells you there's a kinship relationship between two people. It tells you about one person, and it tells you about the other person, and it tells you what the relationship is. Next chart. Another thing that Niem offers is a global identifier for every component in the data. The rule is you stick together the qualified name of the data of the element with the namespace identifier, and that turns into a URI for that particular data component. You can't do this with XML in general, but it works for Niem because of our naming and design rules. Next chart.
So let me just pause for a moment and make sure that that's like a really important piece here. I would personally, I would appreciate it if you said that again or slightly differently. And what's the real value proposition of that? What differentiates it?
So if you have to look at data from different sources, and you see in there that the same name appears in some of the elements, you see last name or target or whatever, how do you know whether they're talking about the same concept or different concepts? If it's Niem data, then each one of these elements has got a URI, and if it's the same concept, it'll be the same URI, and if it's a different concept, it will be different.
So it gives us confidence that we're talking about the same person when we're talking about a particular person.
That would be something different. This gives you confidence that you're talking about a person and not something else where the developer just happened to pick that label person and stuck it on. Are the concepts the same or are they different?
Okay.
So global ID is mildly interesting. It becomes cooler when you look at what you can do with it. So look at the next chart.
Scott?
Yeah.
Just forgive me this is Brian, forgive me for interjecting as you're transitioning, but just to further explain to Daniel and all et al. With regard to person name, for example, what this is showing is that there is a definition within version 4.0 of Niem Core as defined by release.niem.gov that's got the label person name, and within the definition of Niem person name has the meaning of being made up of person's given name, person's surname, etc.
Go to the next chart because Brian is briefing it.
And that is, oh, I'm sorry.
Keep going. You're doing fine.
But that is too. But that helps you by, in essence, think of it as a data dictionary that says, hey, when I say person name in the context of Niem 4.0, I mean a first name, a last name, a middle name, and don't confuse it with this other definition for name that's been person name that's was created by Facebook that really means somebody's nickname, or that was created for TikTok that really means the name of somebody's avatar, etc. It's all about Niem is all about coming to common agreement, common understanding on what this data means and what do you call it to mean exactly this. Sorry, I yield to you, Scott. I hope I didn't steal all your thunder on this slide.
No, you're doing good. Because of this, because everything in Niem data has a unique identifier, and that identifier points into some XML schema, it's fair to describe Niem data as self-describing. If you got the data, you can, at least in principle, look up the definition of anything that you see in it. The Niem Management Office is standing up a registry for Niem IEPDs that's going to make it easier or feasible to actually track down the resource that's identified by these URIs. And if we go to the next chart, I think Brian spoke to that a bit as well. That's fine.
Sorry about
Get extra
that.
points. You get extra points, Brian.
Because we're able to point at data definitions that are used elsewhere, we are able to reuse the data definitions that have been defined in the Niem model by the enterprise. So that in this particular message, the definition of a person's surname, that comes out of the Niem core. They didn't have to make that up. And anybody who understands the Niem core is going to understand the meaning. Then for the person's hair color code, they found that in the justice domain. And anybody can look up the meaning of those codes and understand it as well. So that if you're working with Niem, your developers are able to easily reuse data definitions that have been put together by individual domain community or by all the communities working together for the core. Developers create data definitions where they think they are useful, and developers reuse those data definitions when they're appropriate, when they serve some purpose in your spec. Next chart. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to ask a question. In terms of a new domain, is there a sort of a 80-20 rule here? So are you finding that that 80% of the stuff or some majority of stuff is actually already defined by the core, and that the uniquenesses of another domain are representing, whatever, a smaller percentage? Sort of Pareto is at play here, or is that just depend on the domain and how particular it is?
I don't have any stats, but Tom and Brian may have some useful experience.
Sorry, can you recap that? I was looking at something else because.
Yeah, no, I was just saying, when, like, for instance, with the health domain or in the human services domain, when those started, are we finding that is there a standard that says 80% of the material that a new domain would access is already in the core? Somebody's already thought about it, and that there's a smaller percentage that is actually unique to that particular domain, or does it just depend on each domain?
There isn't an a priori rule that would tell you how much should be where. It tends to be a hands-on. Now, first of all, this is really an end back question. So, this isn't something the NTAC would determine. It's something the business people would determine which elements go into which domains and which go into the core. But it tends to be more, this feels like something everybody uses, and so we put it in core, versus this feels like something that's best governed by this particular domain and this particular domain steward. So it's really more of a, we don't have a, I don't know that there is a set of steps to look at in order to determine where something should go. It's really more of a, let's talk, which is why, the NBAC is representational and has people representing the different domains so that you can draw upon subject matter experts to say, yeah, this is really our stuff. And we should really have that in our domain because we're the people that understand it and we're the people who can best define it and maintain it versus things that aren't. In general, my understanding of the NBAC is that they basically go by consensus. They can vote if they need to, but they rarely have to vote on things. Really, you talk it out and you go, does this belong in core? Does this belong in which domain? Let's talk to the people in those domains. And it becomes much more of a touchy-feely, where does it feel like it belongs? Where are the people who can best maintain it? And let's put it there.
Right. And I'd add in that there's a bit of sort of historical effect as well. Partially because originally Niem was derived from work that the Justice Department was doing. So there's still a little bit of sort of hysteresis in terms of Justice Department definitions showing up in Niem core. But there are also definitions, for instance, my infamous inventory of the 300 plus healthcare related elements that are distributed across 6 other domains. Well, that's because historically those domains needed to exchange some healthcare related information for their own domain specific purposes. And there wasn't a Niem health domain to go to and say, hey, could you define patient name or provider ID for us? We need to use that here in the Justice Department or in screening, et cetera.
Yeah, you see that a lot, and you still see a lot of concepts that are in justice. I mean, keep in mind when the first version of Niem came out, the justice domain was as big as the core. I mean, they were roughly the same size. Half of the first Niem was all justice stuff, and it's slowly moved out and gone into what are the correct homes as those homes became available. But you know, the bottom line is some of the stuff needs to be exchanged, even if there isn't a domain to hold them yet. So you got to put it somewhere.
Now, so the good news, it means that it's a living standard. It's not okay, we defined it and now we're just going to put it on a shelf and expect people will follow it. No, it evolves as domains and agencies and developers find the need for new definitions.
Yeah, and you find, especially if you do IEPD migrations, which I tend to end up having to do a fair amount of the time, and you start to see and you get to watch as you go through different versions, because you can't migrate right from like Niem 2 to Niem 4. You have to go in steps. But each step you can start to see where some of these things have moved, where, oh boy, way back in Niem 2 it was here, and then it moved over to here, and now it's moving over to here. You can actually watch the evolution of the model by looking at small portions of it in the form of an IEPD and migrating it between different versions. You can watch these things as they move to more appropriate areas. You also find that the same concept starts to be represented multiple places, but in different forms as well. And one of those is like person sex, which for the longest time was just male, female, and unknown. And it came from the FBI, and that's what they used in justice at the time, so that's what it was. But then now you start to see, well, rap sheet people have their own needs, and so there's a code for them. And you get into human services, and well, human services deals with kids, and they deal with more current views on gender and sex. And so human services has a much bigger person gender table, code table than was in Niem prior, because these different domains have different needs, have different requirements. And so you got generic ones that go in core, but then you've got specialized ones that are more appropriate for specialized agencies that are specialized domains that go in those domains, because those are the people who know the requirements and know the data.
Hey, we got a question from Anthony. So let me shuffle over there. I don't know if you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. I had a question as far as the different versions, and forgive me if I'm asking a question that has already been addressed. I was stepping in and out. But as far as those versions and potentially being out of sync when you're cutting across different systems, how is that handled? Is there any kind of notification or some sort of ability to be aware of where you're kind of connected with folks, you're out of sync, and those potential issues that can arise when those definitions and things change?
So the version architecture in Niem is such that nobody has to make a change until they're ready. Just because somebody produces a new version of Niem core or a new version of your domain model does not affect the information exchange specification that you defined and you're using. There are IEPDs written in version 1 and 2, and people are using them every day, and it works great because nothing has changed as far as the message definition, and so the code that creates and consumes those messages just keeps right on running.
It's important to remember that IEPDs are written to a particular version of Niem. So, until you update an IEPD, and decide to migrate that IEPD to a newer version of Niem, it's still using that same version of Niem. And all the versions of Niem are all still out there. You can download whatever one you want. I would advise against using Niem 1, but from Niem 2 on, Niem 1 is awful. Don't use it. But from Niem 2 on, these are all fully functional data models. If somebody's using Niem 2 and it's working fine for them, and they're not making any other changes to their exchange, there's no reason they need to migrate an exchange to a new version of Niem simply because there's a new version of Niem. You migrate to a new version of Niem when there's new functionality you need that's better handled by newer versions of Niem. So, if your exchange is defined and it's defined to a particular version of Niem, and you just keep using that for as long as it meets your needs. So people don't get out of sync because Niem version changes happen as part of a new version of an IEPD, which then you would publicize however you do among your exchange partners.
Okay, but that's outside of, I guess there's not necessarily a standard communication or process really. It's up to, that group to really sync up.
So the Niem Management Office runs a process for updating the model on a yearly basis. And most of the domains try to make an update once a year, but nothing keeps them from making updates more frequently, and nothing forces them to update at all. And as far as the people who are using a particular IEPD are concerned, they may not even know that there's a thing called Niem. They just got a spec that says what to put in the messages, and they do it. I mean, I'm confident that happens a lot. Got a spec, tells me what to do, I do it. I don't need to know. I mean, there's these funny URIs like reference.niem.gov, but don't mean nothing to me.
Got it. Thank you.
So let's mush forward a bit. I know you've got plenty more material to cover, so I know that I was the culprit that sort of asked some questions here, but
I think we'll be okay. These next slides march by pretty fast.
Okay,
so
great.
We've seen how XML schemas in the IEPD are providing definition of the content. They tell you what the data means. The other thing that we get, back one please. The other thing we get out of the schemas in the IEPD is constraints on what has to be in the runtime data. So here's a fragment of an XML schema, and what it's saying is that when you talk about a person, the name of the person has to be there. His age, hair color are optional. It may or may not be there, and nothing else is allowed. These tell developers what they have to put in the message that they're producing, what they can expect to find in the message that they're consuming. And together with defining the meaning of the content, this provides the interface contract between the developers that makes the interoperability work. Next slide. I think one more thing we've got. Niem also offers a documentation framework. That is, this IEPD is a collection of artifacts that tell you what's going to be in the message, tell you what the data means, and those artifacts are arranged in a familiar pattern so that once you've got one IEPD, you've seen one, you have a good idea what the next one's going to mean. So, I mean, these are the technical features of Niem that I think are worth pulling out and talking about. You've got the IEPD format. It's really a framework for an information exchange specification. And then you put in your stuff into the framework where it fits to make a complete spec. You get machine testable constraints on runtime data because we're using XML schema to say what has to be in the message. Well, you can validate that with a validating parser. You can do that development time. You can do that at test and certification. You can do it runtime if you want. Most people don't, but I think you can. The data that we're passing is self-describing because of the global identifiers that are pointing to schema resources. And then we also get the benefit of data definition reuse, because the Niem model contains things that the different communities have decided are going to be worth reusing. Next chart. So now I'm going to run you through the Lego slides. What's it like to be a designer of a Niem information exchange spec? Well, you pull stuff out of the model and compose them into your message description. Next chart. So really, this is how the Niem process is used to produce one of those IEPDs. Next. I forget exactly where this metaphor came from. Somebody at GTRI told it to me first, that working with the Niem model to build an IEPD is kind of like building a model out of Lego blocks. And it's not the new Lego models where you get the blocks to build the Harry Potter Temple of Doom set, and that's the only thing you can do with it. It's like the old Lego sets, the ones they had when I was a kid, where it's just full of blocks. They have different colors and different sizes, and what you build out of those is entirely up to you. Nobody's telling you what to build. One of the things that the Niem technical specification does, well, really what the Niem tech specs do is like what the technical specifications for Lego blocks do. Those pegs and those circles, they have to be exactly the right size and exactly the right place, or the blocks aren't going to snap together. Same thing with the Niem tech specs. Your XML schema has to be done this way. Otherwise, the components that are created by the different domain communities, they're not going to snap together either. But Niem's even better than Lego blocks because if there's a block that you need that's not in your set, it's easy for you to make it and then build the model that you want. And all the blocks are free. Nobody pays anything to use Niem. Next chart. So let's imagine that we are the designer of an IEPD, and we're going to try and put it together with components that we find out of the Niem model. The first step, really the step where the most work goes into, is identifying the information exchange needs. What is it that people need to have in the messages that we're trying to define? You don't necessarily have to know all of your partners for this. All you have to know is the facts that need to be expressed in the message. And once you have that, then you can start building a schema to express those facts in XML. Let's have the next chart. So in this scenario, one of the things I need in my message is to put in the point of contact for the guy who's sending it. How can somebody reach out and talk to him? Well, if you search the Niem model, you will find in the Niem core an element called contact information, which the meaning of that is exactly the meaning that I need for point of contact. So I'm going to take that component out of the Niem model and I'm going to add it to the schema set in my IEPD. Next chart. So in my scenario, I'm talking about some sensor, and it has a location, but it also has an orientation. What is it pointing at? What direction is it looking in? If you look in the Niem model, you won't find that in the core, but you'll find it in the military operations domain. There's an element named orientation, and its definition is exactly what I need from my model. So I'll take it out of the MilOps domain and I'll put it in my schema set. Now, there's no rule that says I can only look in one domain. I mean, my scenario here is military oriented, but I find stuff in Chem Bio or Justice or anywhere. I am free to pick those components and use them. Next chart. So in my scenario, one of the things I need to know is the name of this sensor. And if you look in the Niem model, there's really nothing that tells you that. So I have to make it up. I define my own data component, writing a little chunk of XML schema, and then I use this in my IEPD set. Now, if I want to, I can go to a domain and say, I just defined this component. I think it belongs in here. Why don't you add it? And maybe they will, but I don't have to do that if I don't want to. Next chart. So the last thing is maybe the component I need is defined in some other standard. They already have a definition for this. And then instead of writing my own in like I did for the yellow block, I can use what Niem calls an adapter, which is like wrapping a shell, a Lego-shaped shell around that external component, and now it will snap into the things that I have in my schema set. We've done this for, in the geospatial domain, Niem has adapters for some of the most important GML components. Worked that out with the Open Geospatial Consortium and took their advice and built it into Niem 3. And it can be done with other things as well. Next chart.
So this brings up a question around HL7. Maybe we might want to hold that question, Daniel, but I just put it out there since that's some of the discussions we've been having now for several months, which is, you know, are there resources and other data models that could be adapted or integrated into Niem? And I'm not sure if that's exactly what you're speaking to here, but I'd be curious to know, and we can table it for later, but I'm just curious if that's part of what you're explaining here.
So it's definitely possible. I've looked some at HL7. I've looked at FIRE. There are data definitions that you could put into a Niem adapter and use in a Niem IAPD. It's certainly possible. And then the question is, how much benefit do you get out of doing this?
Yeah.
Next chart. So you're done when you have schema components for all of the information needs in your Exchange spec. You've found or created XML schema components for everything that you need to put in the message, and you've stuck them together in a single schema that makes sense, and you can use that schema to validate messages at runtime. At this point, you're done with the IAPD. This tells you how to implement the messages. Next chart. So if you're a producer, you take this thing and it tells you what has to go in the messages you're trying to send. You write some source code that reaches into your internal data representation, pulls out the stuff that has to go in the message, arranges it properly, and that's what you transmit out to the other guy. Some XML that has your content and fits the IAPD format. Next chart. Consumers do the same thing, right? They know they're going to get this message, so they have to parse it. They have to take out the parts that they care about, put it into their internal data representation, do whatever it is they need to do with this. Next chart. And so this works with any number of producers and any number of consumers. Anybody that wants to send or receive this message can write some code to produce or consume the messages. And the value proposition for a large enterprise comes because, well, a couple things that you get out of doing this Niem. And one is you're probably going to do, developers are probably going to do more than one of these Niem interfaces. And those interfaces are probably going to talk about a lot of the same thing. They probably all talk about properties of people, for example. That's pretty common. So whatever you learned in the first message, you don't have to learn it over again for the second and the third and the fourth. That you can exploit sort of an overlap in the information exchange needs. And the other thing that you get is because the exchanges are rigorously documented, the knowledge of what goes in a message will survive any particular developers. As developers come and go in your system, the meaning of the message that you're supposed to send is still there. That knowledge doesn't leave when the developers do. Next chart. So, I mean, this is what the Lego is supposed to say. You compose your message specification by choosing things that in the Niem core and the Niem domains that suit your needs. If you can't find what you need, you create what you need, or maybe you find what you need in some other standard than Niem. Developers then implement this by writing some software to produce or consume the message that conform, and none of this is pairwise by system. We encourage, you want to have multiple producers and multiple consumers. So that's it for the Lego block understanding of message design. And all I have left to talk about in the slides are some of the myths that accrete around Niem and my attempt to knock some of them down. Are we ready for that?
Yeah, I think so. I know that there's one of the questions we can take now, again, coming back to the, this group is particularly focused on the HL7 to Niem universe exchange, both through the proof of concept as well as the general, the general audience, which is very, a lot of folks are HL7 Fire focused. We're trying to bring that together. So maybe we can come back to it again. I know, Brian, you've spoken to this quite a bit as well in terms of that crosswalk that Dan is asking about here, and where that, where do you see that happening? Do you see that happening? Is that an important, useful step as we go forward?
I think this would be a good time for Brian to answer that.
As I threw it over to him there.
Yes, we have started that crosswalk. One of the challenges is knowing just how much or how little of HL7, of clinical healthcare, and for that matter, administrative healthcare, payer healthcare aspects, should we attempt to map over into Niem. And I've been approaching it from the point of view of a case by case. As we come up with scenarios, working on doing the mapping so that we are ready. And my expectation is that once we get a Niem health domain stood up, that's going to be one of the major focuses of the work of the domain. And it's between that, doing a mapping from HL7 and Fire to Niem in a healthcare domain by healthcare domain basis, as well as from the Niem perspective, going domain by domain, refreshing my inventory of what health-related elements have already been defined over in the Niem domains, and in essence, back mapping them back to how is it defined in HL7, since so few of those Niem definitions were based on the HL7 or any other healthcare standards. So there's a bit of tidying up work that needs to be done on the Niem side of things, as well as the mapping and modeling work that's necessary from the HL7 side of things.
Great.
And by the way, it's a big job. We're talking the prospect of tens of thousands of element definitions. If you were to attempt to map all of what has been and is being defined within HL7. One of the reasons Fire decided to take the 80% route was because it only required defining 20% of what has already been done out there in the healthcare world for data modeling. And somebody correct me if I got that one wrong, by the way, not being the Fire expert on this call.
So I see a couple questions in the chat window that I think now is a good time to talk about.
Great.
Nikolai's question about compliance and conformance. Niem is pretty good with tools that help you check conformance. Our specifications are pretty rigorous, and many of them are written in schematron and can be automatically applied to your IEPD. So a lot of the tests for conformance of the message spec, those can be automated. There's some pieces that require human judgment, but quite a lot of the work of testing conformance can be done by a machine. And then you can do the same thing with the producers and the consumers of the messages. You can test those for conformance by seeing whether they validate against the IEPD schema. And then there are a few Niem rules as well that also written in schematron that you can evaluate on the machine. So that tells you whether or not somebody is doing the right thing. Compliance, making them do the right thing, Niem doesn't have any role in that at all. You have to come up with that on your own.
Let me explain what I mean by compliance, Scott. For example, I'm writing grant, right, for new contractor who will work for me for the government. I can say, okay, please, you need to use HL7 standard, ISO standard, or any other standard and be compliant. There is no such way when I use Niem model. This is my point.
So you can write compliance rules. That's not something that Niem does for you, but it does provide the conformance tests that let you do it. So I have drafted for the Department of Defense some acquisition guidance on how you can be Niem complying by implementing Niem conforming interfaces.
And historically, part of the reason you don't see compliance in the context of Niem is that compliance implies that there's somebody there to check for compliance, and that is not true for Niem as a whole. There's nobody. I mean, there are tools to see that you're conformant, to see that you followed certain rules, but there really is nobody for the most part. Now, DHS has had something for a while, but there's nobody to give you the official stamp of, yes, this is compliant with Niem and you did everything right. There's nobody to do that. You can hire people to give you their, you can hire me to give you my opinion on how closely you complied with Niem, but all you're going to have is, well, Tom said so, and that's nothing official. There is no official stamp of approval for your work, and that's part of why we never say compliance, because you say compliance, that implies that there is some test for compliance, that there's some body that gives you a stamp of approval, and that just doesn't exist, partially due to lack of resources, partially due to the distributed nature of Niem. How are you possibly going to have a body who can make those kind of decisions for all the different domains and all their different kind of content?
Tom, this is Brian. That may change in the not too distant future, at least to a minor extent. As part of the IEPD registry task force or Tiger team or whatever we're called, one of the issues that has been brought up is whether or not an IEPD that's registered should get a good housekeeping seal of approval, if you will. And if we were to provide that kind of a rating mechanism, who would do the rating? Is it something that we leave open to the domain, to the Niem community as a whole? Is it something where we create another Tiger team to review IEPDs? I think to some extent it will depend on just what volume of new IEPDs end up getting registered. But it is something that is being actively discussed. May not be quite as strong as a compliance certification, but it's a step in the right direction.
So this is Catherine, and I'd like to elaborate on that point.
Catherine, hi.
Hi. And so, yes, we are looking at what that would look like in the long term of the registry repository. But I'll tell you, kind of taking the crawl, walk, run approach, if you will, that the initial steps of looking at an IEPD would be to just validate it that it had its basic components and that, largely there's nothing nefarious going on within the IEPD, right? Which is one of the major concerns that this work group has presented as something that we wanted to, if we're going to have a repository of IEPDs, we don't want somebody to download and it has a Trojan or something like that in it. As far as the latter, endorsing it as being NEAM compliant, I think that's going to be, maybe in a second or third phase iteration of getting the registry repository stood up, but it's definitely on the books of things that we have to consider.
Hey, Catherine, I hope I wasn't speaking out of turn here.
Not at all. No, you're definitely.
What we talked about yesterday.
I just wanted to kind of set some parameters so nobody expects that that's the first thing out of the gate when we do the when we launch.
Right. I did want to answer Rita's question about duplication in creating concepts across domains.
Go.
And just to say that, yes, that is an ongoing issue. It's something that the harmonization task force works on in trying to identify those kinds of problems and correct them, either by gently merging concepts, as I mentioned earlier about the Justice Department location facilities information elements that were that are currently being sort of realigned with definitions that are already in NEAM core. And it's just the nature of the beast when you're doing this work as multiple independent domains, that yes, sometimes a domain is going to come up with something that they need that duplicates something else that a different domain came up with at about the same time. And it takes a couple of iterations before the harmonization can be achieved between them. But it ends up resulting in a very creative, very dynamic and standards development environment where a lot of work can get done, while at the same time ensuring that at least over time, we end up merging to some common definitions. Over.
Susan has a question. Susan Fox has a question about the source of test data to use to test for compliance or conformance, perhaps. Is anyone able to answer that?
The answer there is not really. The things that you test for conformance in NEAM are things like the XML schema that you use in your IEPD, and it's on the IEPD designer to create those. And when he's done, then you can test his schema for conformance. You can test the whole IEPD package for conformance. But these are things that you're creating, not. So there's nothing that you would, no test data that you could run into it.
Okay.
Once your message spec is created, then you can design test data for the messages. Is this a valid message? This is not a valid message. But again, that would be something on the Exchange designer. It's not something that anybody else could provide in advance. So the real answer is no, not really. That's not the way you test NEAM.
So this is Rita. Can I actually go back to my question, which I thank you, Brian, for addressing it. But I was wondering if you could explain a little bit more about how the harmonization aspect works. Because, for example, like, of course, me thinking from like the matching lens, say like one domain calls it person and another domain calls it individual. How do you harmonize that?
Well, we have representatives from across the Niem community who have those types of issues raised to them through the NBAC requirements definition process. And then the harmonization team takes a look at those questions, the issues that have been raised, and say, you know, is this a problem or is it not a problem? Gee, in some cases, I think we've had to reach out to individuals from the domain to say, what did you really mean by individual rather than person? Were you trying to come up with some, were you trying to solve a problem that Niem Core person type couldn't handle? In other cases, we may turn around and say, you know, no, this really is the same concept as person. So, you know, I think we need to deprecate the use of this particular definition in, you know, I'm just picking on agriculture here, the agriculture domain, talking about an individual, and encourage everyone to use NC person instead of ag individual. And there are also cases where you look at the subtle difference between two different definitions, and you want to come back and say, well, actually, this doesn't qualify for being a new element, a new data type. This really needs to be what's called an augmentation on the existing NC person element. So we work through the process of both defining and helping the domain to define an augmentation to the person definition. That is an extension, think of it as an extension of the person in order to capture that subtle difference between individual and person so that we can get refocused on person as being the robust and widely used definition for everyone. And Catherine, have I represented harmonization well enough?
As best as I understand it, actually, I think I will fill that to Scott.
Yeah, the important thing to understand here is that all of the work is done by cooperating communities. There's no stick involved in this at all. Individual and person will be harmonized if the groups involved think it's worth the trouble to do so. Will we have a better model afterwards? If everybody says yes, then they do it.
There will probably still be some Niem 4.1 implementation that uses ag:"individual" instead of person. It's not like we're going to force forwards compatibility on previously implemented systems.
So I see a question about is the harmonization open to anyone or is it invite only? Each of the domains runs as a voluntary consensus standards body. There are rules. Any stakeholder, interested stakeholder can participate. Process is open, it runs with consensus. At the core level, participation is limited to 2 representatives from each domain. In practice, any stakeholder with something to contribute is usually welcome, but the rules don't say they have to have a seat.
Yeah, there looks like there's another question from Susan around runtime and processing, and whether or not Niem is affected by that much, or using Niem as it affects that.
So the unique identifiers for the component name, like the NC:person, there's a unique identifier for that XML element. That doesn't mean there's a unique identifier for each chunk of data in the message that fills out a Niem Core person. That would be up to the Exchange designer to decide if he needed one. And So when it comes to transfer time and processing time, I point people to the efficient XML interchange spec from the W3C. I see in practice, some remarkable size compression and processing times that that technology supports. In general, say don't worry about message size, or if you have problems with that message size, Niem is not your problem.
Great.
We got 13 minutes left. We'll try to tackle some myth busters, or just try more questions. Well, let's go forward and see what we got.
Yep, that's great.
So Niem started out with XML. It was entirely XML based. The Niem Management Office came and beat on the NTAC until we finally agreed, all right, we'll see about using JSON. It turned out to be really liberating. So all kinds of things are coming out of that. But what we have now is your Niem conforming data. It can be XML. You can do it in JSON LD. You can do it in RDF. We've got tools and guidance for all of that. We're working on how you take XML schema and express that in JSON schema, which would be really hard because JSON schema just doesn't do the things we need. And also express it as RDF plus OWL. One thing you get there is, since everything has a unique ID, it's possible to take these Niem schema equivalents and connect them to whatever kind of ontology or upper ontology you're using. Long pole in the tent for me here is use cases. Somebody really wants to do it and has a reason for doing it. If I get those, then it'll be a lot faster. Next chart. So one of the myths that we run into is people thinking all I have to do is implement Niem and then I'm interoperable with everybody else who implements Niem. But it doesn't work that way. Niem's just a framework for doing the message specs. If you implement a message spec, then yeah, you're interoperable with everybody else who implements that message spec. But there's no magic Niem thing that you can implement and be magically interoperable with everybody else. It just doesn't work that way. Next chart. It's not that hard. Don't try to learn Niem by reading the text specs. That is hard. That's like trying to write a web service and start with the IPv4 specification. Nobody does that. There's some training tools, and the easy way to learn how to write an IEPD is to look at one that's already done and see how they did it. Next chart. So starting to use Niem is not necessarily a big commitment. At the simplest level, you just take a Niem IEPD and implement it, and you may not even know that Niem exists. It could happen in the biometrics domain. The international standard for biometrics is Niem based. And I'm just confident that there are a lot of people writing code to that spec that don't know what Niem is, never heard of Niem.gov. The next level up, maybe you just start reusing some of the data definitions from Niem Model in your stuff. Next step up is maybe you're going to go all the way to design a complete IEPD and use that. You might get together with people that have shared interests and come up with your own shared model without forming a domain. Maybe you're thinking of yourself as a subdomain, or maybe you're just coming up with the definitions that work for you and you don't need the overhead of a Niem domain. That works. And you know,
Scott,
go ahead.
you can almost think about the NIC, the folks that you're presenting to right now, as being a super domain, given that they're trying to define how to exchange information between healthcare, human services, the courts, schools, etc.
Yep.
And this is also the world of Niem on Smart on Fire that I've mentioned a couple of times at NTAC meetings.
All right, I see I'm down to 4 minutes. All I want to say on this slide is how much Niem you decide to use is up to you. Next chart. I like this chart a lot for the DOT because they look at that hierarchy and then they see a hierarchy and they assume it means control and somebody's going to try and boss them around. But Niem does not work that way. There's no mechanism to make anybody do anything. It's all about cooperation. It's not about control, and I think that's why Niem is successful. When you try to impose control, then people all of a sudden really care about what goes in your data model. I've seen Marine officers ready to go across the table because the proposed standard for a message would not support the way that they did air tasking. They weren't going to have that. People really care about data definitions if you have to use them. But if it's a matter of cooperation, of using what makes sense, then you can get a lot more done. The Dr. Scott rule here is that the scope of useful cooperation greatly exceeds the span of effective control. Next chart. So a lot of people think that you're not allowed to use Niem because it's a government standard and the public law and the OMB regulation tell you to use open standards. But in fact, Niem fits the requirements of the law and the OMB circular. There's a picture of governance on the side. And the thing to understand is that everything below the PMO, the NTAC, the NBAC, the domains, they operate as voluntary consensus standards body. PMO doesn't order them to do things. The PMO is there to support the things that they're doing. I think that's about it. Yep, that's all I got. A lot of good questions. How many individuals are involved in the Niem process, I do not know. At the face-to-face meetings, we would sometimes see 50 or 75 people, but there's a lot more people behind the scenes that are doing Niem things.
Well, thank you very much. I'm glad we, in a way, had the luxury of time to go into some of the details here and have some conversation around it. Definitely appreciate your willingness and other contributors to it. I think there's probably a lot more questions, but I think it'll be a good, good sort of primer for the Niem Health presentation, which we'll be scheduling, as we said, at some point in the near future. So I want to thank you, Dr. Renner, for taking the time. We will be posting these sites, these slides on the site. You'll be able to dive into them, and of course, niem.gov is plenty of information on there as well. And for members who are explicitly involved with this, you can find them on the hub itself. You can ask for sort of connecting with people if that's helpful to you in various ways there. And I just want to point out in the last 2 minutes here what we've got coming up here. So this Friday we will be looking at child welfare, both our own Adam Pertman, who is part of the stewards team, and also Daniel Hempel, who is publisher of the Chronicle of Social Change and has been following and pursuing child welfare. This is not only in itself important, but it's also for the Niem world. Child Welfare and Children's Bureau has been an adopter of Niem, and we expect that, with both as social determinants moves forward and some of the particular programs around integrated care for kids and whole person, that child welfare is a big part of it in some areas. And so there'll be a connecting point here as well. It probably won't be as technical, but it will be laying the sort of the groundwork for that, for those conversations, and particularly the proof of concept, which will be focused on child welfare, Medicaid, courts, and those kinds of things that you can find out more about. Following that, we have a Bright Hive presentation on data trusts and what they've been able to do over the last year or so. It's fascinating in terms of being able to bring data together and provide access and security in a pretty unique way. And so I'm excited to hear more about from them as well. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we have a terrific project that we'll be featuring on public libraries. And the OCLS has been working closely with a number of organizations and jurisdictions to really look at how public libraries can be both a disseminator of information and help really address, and particularly the opioid crisis. But as we started learning more about this, I think there's something in the order of 16 or 17,000 libraries across the country. And as we think about disseminating knowledge and information, libraries are becoming more and more trusted community members. I've sat through several of their webinars and have found them to be terrific presenters. And for anybody who is addressing the opioid issue from anywhere or from any particular function, it's fascinating. We are also talking with the AHRQ to potentially join or complement this with some of the research they have done on opioids. So we'll be coming back to the opioid question a couple more times. And finally, as I said, please join, participate, feel free. You can add a blog, your thoughts, your responses, you can interact with people. And like Niem, we are very much looking forward to people who want to roll up their sleeves, give a little bit of time. My last statement here is on collaboration sites, and we've been working with this for quite a while now, and many of you have contributed to the formation and the development of it. It's a little bit like stone soup here. Collaboration happens when everybody participates, and our goal is to hope that that people carve out more time during their day so it becomes a recognized and an acknowledged and a supported activity to spend 15 minutes a week or a half an hour, or in the case of Let's Get Technical, an hour and a half a week participating, contributing. There's a lot of energy around it, and we believe that there's way more to come as we move further into it. So join, participate. You'll be seeing more groups being stood up, and in particular, the two new ones we have up here should be of interest, especially regarding the Niem work. So with that, I think we are at the end of our time here. We've had a great attention from many folks today. We appreciate that. Look for your comments. Again, I want to thank our presenters, and we look forward to seeing some more conversation and discussion. And with that, have a great rest of the day. Again for everyone, and we'll talk to you soon.
Bye. Thank you all.